Dr. Sophia Murphy. She will be speaking on food security and trade. And just a little bit about who she is. Dr. Sophia Murphy joined the Institute of Agriculture and Trade Policy as an executive director in October 2020. She is a food systems and international economy expert with over 30 years of professional experience, including as a board chair, a program director, policy analyst, and a published writer. She is also a policy expert and advocate who has focused on resilient food systems, agriculture, and international trade. Sophia has worked primarily with civil society organizations, as well as with government, intergovernmental organizations, and universities. Thank you so much, Dr. Sophia Murphy, for being here. Please go ahead and share your presentation.
Thank you. And it's just me, no presentation this morning, but I hope I'll be able to engage you for a few minutes really to build on what Thomas has said and before we really dive into the experience on the continent in Africa. So I'm also speaking in more general terms, planning to say something about what is food insecurity, to dig into what Thomas was setting up for us as the scale of the problem, but how can we think about what that is composed of, to think about how I frame the relationships involved in food security, which I think Thomas was also pointing to. And then the conundrum that we face around meeting a human right, the right to food, at the same time as we have a lot of economic hope resting on the agricultural sector and what it can do for different countries. And I think for African governments and societies in particular, that poses big challenges. And then to look briefly at the three big causes of hunger in recent years, before coming to touch on agroecology, which I think we'll come back to in the course of the seminar, and I'm excited to see that at the end. So just to say, the idea of what hunger and food insecurity is has evolved over time, and it has a chronological history as well as many component parts that are often now presented to us, often as the four pillars: the supply, the question of access, the question of nutrition or utilization, and finally this question of stability. But those all have a history that come and they have shaped how agricultural policy has emerged. Supply remains the most predominant concern. And I think a lot of the outcomes we see that are poor for both nutrition and for poverty are linked to an emphasis on agriculture only as a machine of production and not understanding that food security actually requires people to access the food that we produce, that the food may be nutritious. And then this question of stability, to which we've added now environmental concerns, and I'll come back to that. Climate change is one of the biggest sources of both shock and stress on food systems. And the question of agency, which for us at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy is one of the reasons we espouse agroecology as a way of thinking about the food systems that we want, because it puts at the heart of our food policy the communities that grow and produce the food and the consumers of the food. And very often both food and agriculture policy leave out those voices in favor of the companies that are in the business of food and in the interests of those providing inputs to the farmers or retailing the food to the consumers. So that the idea of agroecology is to center the agency of the humans ultimately involved in bringing the food to us and then in consuming that food. So if we think about food security, and especially this question of stability, one of the things that we've also learned is that it's about a system, and we are working in a system, and it is systems that affect what we do. And that comes to my second point about how I think about hunger. It's really about relationships. And a lot of the work we do on hunger and food insecurity is about relationships in the household and what happens when a household is disrupted, or if you like, destabilized, and the way that that causes hunger. It can happen just for cultural reasons. Women are often, underprivileged in a household setup, but it also happens when a member of the household gets sick or when another member of the family comes to live with you. You also have relationships between state and citizens, and that's where we claim our rights to right to hunger, as we're rights holders and duty bearers. The state has a very important role in ensuring that food is available and that food can be accessed by people. And that's an important relationship, and you see it break down. States in conflict, states that don't, the states that have different minority groups for various reasons that are not treated with full dignity. And then you have relationships around trade partners, and Thomas touched on some of those. And in the global sphere, you see deeply unequal trade relationships and deeply unequal negotiations on how trade rules should work. And you see a lot of inequality between the companies buying commodities and the growers that produce them. You see a lot of inequality among the countries that can import a lot of food and have big budgets versus countries, and many of them are in Africa, that rely on a lot of food imports, but don't have a lot of purchasing power, and so are unable to keep up if prices are suddenly shocked and go higher. And of course, the continent has seen a lot of those international price shocks in the last year. The invasion of Ukraine had a disproportionate effect on net food importing countries because it affected both oils and wheat, two starches, two big sources of our calories, which are not enough to be food secure, but is certainly an important part of food security. So this question of whether food is a human right or food is your agriculture is your engine of economic development is something that I don't think any country has managed very well. And I just put it there as one of the challenges that I think governments have. They want it to contribute to their export income. They want it to contribute to the employment in their country. They want it to be an engine of growth. But at the same time, they have to assure that people can reach food, and the market doesn't ensure anybody access to food. It simply provides those who can pay the most with what they need, with what they want, rather. So just in a few more minutes, these three big causes, you can see a lot of this on the Food and Agriculture website. The three C's, there's conflict, and everyone knows peace first and foremost is essential to food security. Can't really overstate the importance of it, although often in these food circles we don't talk about war and conflict except as a humanitarian crisis. But of course it's deeply disruptive of long-term food security as well, for there not to be secure control of resources, for people to be able to stay where they are. The Ukraine war is a different example, where a war very far away has sent a shock into an international system, both to access to the supply and to the distribution of that food, because the distribution systems are also affected by sanctions and other actions. The second C is COVID, and the pandemic has been an important cause of hunger, and Thomas touched upon that. It's increased indebtedness of states, so that governments that do import food find it harder to find the currency to pay for the food imports they need. It also affected, in its immediate context, it affected remittances, and Africa is one of the continents that depends most heavily on remittances of migrant workers, and that was cut off for a time. And of course, overseas development assistance was affected as the rich countries spent a lot more money at home on social protection and were less willing to spend money abroad. But one of the positive things about COVID for me is that it did break a habit of saying the state can't afford this. And it did push a lot of states into thinking about their social protection programs. And we saw a decade or more of investment in social protection come good. I think something like 165 countries put in place measures to respond to COVID. And that was a powerful use of state, machinery, public machinery, to respond to that question of food as a right, as opposed to food as just something you afford if you can. So for me, that was a positive outcome. And I think you see a new willingness in the state to invest in public goods as a result of the pandemic. And then this final thing that I'll touch on, the final cause, of course, is climate change. With us now, causing hunger and death here and now, even though the international conversation still talks about 2030 and 2050 as if climate change was something with an end date. And it's affected all the growing conditions. It's pushed a lot of people into forced migration. That's another cause of hunger. When you're pushed out from where you live, you're far less food secure. It's also threatened the infrastructure. Food security is about being able to get food from one place to another. And the onset of floods, the kind of catastrophe that you saw in Pakistan earlier this year, that is not just destroyed the food that is there and killed people, but it's also taken out roads, taken out rail lines, destabilized all of the infrastructure you need in order to move food from one place to another. So climate change is something that forces us to think about adaptation. And I think all along this, another word I just want to put out in my last moment is to say, we need to think about adaptive solutions to a problem that is a system in its making. It isn't something with an end goal that you know, 95% of children not stunted. That would be a great thing to have as an outcome, but it'll depend on so many other pieces being put into place. And so we have to think about the system, and then that gives us other openings to think about how we might intervene, how you can put food in a child's mouth directly, but you can also do things to stabilize the household where the child lives, the country in which the child lives. That there are other pieces of this web that are going to ensure a food secure outcome. And I feel like that can seem overwhelming, but it also gives us lots of places to come in and make a difference. And I hope, Kevin, you'll pick up the agroecology piece, because my time is up. But for us, that's a very hopeful place to start, because it understands food security as a system and a set of relationships. Thank you, Ziki. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy, for that very also insightful presentation on food systems, and how you mentioned the last part on how we need adaptive solutions to our current issues. And I strongly agree, because the globe is forever, in fact, the world, let me say, is forever evolving. And so we need to also be ready to meet it as it evolves.